Have you ever walked through an orchard at dusk and felt like the trees were watching you? Like each branch and leaf had eyes that followed your every move? Perhaps you dismissed it as your imagination running wild, the shadows playing tricks in the dimming light. But what if I told you that in some orchards, particularly those with a dark history, the trees really do watch? And remember, if you're enjoying this dark tale, please take a moment to comment where you're from. And if you want to help our channel continue sharing these hidden histories that others try to suppress, please subscribe now. Your support is what allows us to bring these forgotten stories to light. The spring of 1853 in Howard County, Maryland, began like any other. The peach and apple orchards that dotted the rolling countryside burst into fragrant bloom, promising a bountiful harvest to come. Plantation owners inspected their fields with satisfaction, while slaves toiled under the watchful eyes of overseers, their backs bent beneath the weight of America's peculiar institution. Thornfield Plantation, owned by the prestigious Montgomery family for 3 generations, was considered one of the most prosperous estates in the region. Situated on over 500 acres of prime Maryland soil, the plantation was known for its exceptional fruit orchards and the unusually high yield of its crops. What few outside the plantation knew, however, was that Thornfield's success came at a terrible price. According to county records accessed from the Maryland Historical Society archives, the Montgomery plantation had an unusually high mortality rate among its enslaved population. While neighboring plantations averaged a 3 to 5% annual death rate, already a horrifying statistic by any human measure, Thornfield consistently recorded losses of 8 to 12%. Local authorities never investigated these numbers. After all, slaves were considered property, not people, and Mr. Everett Montgomery was a respected member of the community, a church deacon, and a generous contributor to local political campaigns. The historical record shows that in the winter of 1852, Everett Montgomery purchased 2 young women from a slave auction in Baltimore. The bill of sale, still preserved in county records, identifies them only as 2 female Negroes of Guinea stock, sisters, ages approximately 16 and 14 years. They were given the names Mercy and Grace Montgomery. What makes this particular purchase noteworthy is that these sisters, according to plantation records kept by Montgomery's overseer, Nathan Blackwood, were purchased specifically for special purposes related to the maintenance and prosperity of the orchard grounds. This unusual designation has puzzled historians for decades. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a historian specializing in American slavery practices at Johns Hopkins University, explains, while it wasn't uncommon for plantation owners to assign specific slaves to specialized tasks, the wording in this case is peculiar. Fruit orchards typically required seasonal labor for pruning, pollination assistance, and harvesting, not year-round maintenance by specifically selected individuals. The sisters' arrival at Thornfield coincided with what several contemporary accounts describe as an unexplained illness affecting the Montgomery orchard. Local newspaper archives from the Maryland Gazette mentioned that the winter of 1852 had been unusually mild, followed by an early false spring that caused the trees to bud prematurely. A sudden frost then damaged many orchards throughout the region. However, while neighboring plantations suffered partial losses, the Montgomery orchard appeared to be dying entirely. According to a diary entry from Abigail Montgomery, Everett's wife, dated January 20th, 1853, Everett returned from Baltimore today with 2 young slave girls. Sisters, he says, from somewhere deep in Africa. He has been in the most peculiar mood since his return, locking himself in his study with old books from his grandfather's collection. When I inquired about the unusual purchase, for we have no need of house slaves, and these girls appear too slight for field work, he merely stated that they would make the trees bear fruit again. I worry about my husband's state of mind since the orchard began to wither. What followed over the next 3 months is documented sporadically through various sources, including Overseer Blackwood's logs, Abigail Montgomery's diary, and local church records. The sisters were housed separately from the other slaves, in a small outbuilding adjacent to the orchard, rather than in the communal slave quarters. They were forbidden to speak to the other enslaved people and worked only in the orchard under Everett Montgomery's personal supervision. The few interactions between the sisters and other inhabitants of Thornfield were noted as troubling and unsettling. Several accounts mention that the girls never spoke, even to each other, but communicated through gestures, expressions, and what one house slave described as a humming that made the air feel heavy. Thomas Wheeler, a neighboring plantation owner, wrote in a letter to his brother dated March 3, 1853, "Visited Montgomery yesterday regarding the purchase of timber rights. Found him much altered, thin and nervous, with a distracted air about him. He insisted we walk through his orchard, which I was startled to see had begun to recover most impressively from the winter damage. The trees were not merely surviving, but thriving, heavy with blossoms well ahead of the season." When I remarked upon this miraculous recovery, Montgomery became agitated, insisting it was merely the result of ancient agricultural techniques from the old country. It was then I noticed 2 young slave girls working among the distant trees. They moved in a most peculiar manner, almost gliding between the trunks, reaching up to touch the branches with strange deliberation. Montgomery caught my gaze and hurriedly steered me back toward the house, speaking loudly about timber prices as though to drown out some sound I could not hear. As we departed the orchard, I swear the blossoms turned to follow our movement, like hundreds of tiny eyes. By late March, rumors began circulating among both the white and enslaved communities about strange occurrences at Thornfield Plantation. The orchard, which had been on the verge of death, was now growing at an unnatural rate. The trees bore fruit months before the natural season, and in quantities that defied explanation. More disturbing were the stories from slaves who had been assigned to harvest this premature bounty. They reported finding bizarre markings carved into the trunks, symbols that none recognized, but all found deeply unsettling. Some claimed that when the wind blew through the orchard at night, the rustling leaves sounded like whispered conversations. Reverend Jonathan Simmons noted in his parish records that several of the Montgomery slaves had approached him after Sunday services, requesting prayer for protection against what they described as the old spirits the sisters brought with them. When he pressed for clarification, they would say nothing more, fearful of punishment should their master learn of their concerns. On April 2, 1853, Abigail Montgomery made what would be her final diary entry. "I can no longer pretend not to see what is happening. Last night I woke to find Everett's side of the bed empty. From our bedroom window I observed lantern light in the orchard and, against my better judgment, wrapped myself in a shawl and followed. What I witnessed I can scarcely bring myself to describe." Everett stood in a clearing among the trees, the sisters kneeling before him. They were covered in some dark substance, soil or perhaps something worse, and Everett was reading from his grandfather's book while the girls swayed in unison, that terrible humming emanating from their throats. The trees around them, dear God, the trees were moving without wind, branches bending toward the girls like supplicants. And the fruit, the early fruit hanging from those unnatural branches, in the lantern light, I swear they resembled tiny, malformed faces. Everett saw me and his expression. There was nothing of my husband in those eyes, only hunger and something triumphant. "They're making the land remember," he said, "the old ways, the true payment for abundance." I fled back to the house and have locked myself in my room. I hear him downstairs now, pacing. The girl's humming seems to have followed him from the orchard. How can I hear it so clearly through walls and doors? I'm sending a message to my brother in Baltimore with our most trusted house slave. I must leave this place. Whether Abigail's message ever reached her brother remains unknown. Historical records confirm that on April 15th, a fire broke out in the main house of Thornfield Plantation. Everett and Abigail Montgomery both perished in the blaze. In the chaos following the fire, according to statements given by surviving house slaves to authorities, overseer Nathan Blackwood took control of the plantation. His first recorded action was to order that the two sisters be returned to the communal slave quarters and assigned to regular field work. However, what happened next transformed a tragedy into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in pre-Civil War Maryland. From the official report filed by Howard County Sheriff William Harrison, dated April 20th, 1853, responding to a report from N. Blackwood, overseer of Thornfield Plantation, arrived on site at approximately 6:30 in the morning to find a most disturbing scene. In the orchard, discovered the bodies of two female slaves, identified as sisters purchased by the late Mr. Montgomery earlier this year. The deceased were found seated on branches of separate trees, their backs against the trunks, approximately 15 feet above the ground. No evidence of ropes, ladders, or other means of ascent were present. According to Blackwood, both girls had been locked in the slave quarters under guard the previous night, following attempted escape. Most unusual is the condition of the bodies. Though they appear to have died during the night, there are no visible wounds or signs of violence. Their expressions are described by witnesses as peaceful and smiling. Most disturbing is the discovery that both corpses had tree bark growing over their hands and feet, partially embedding them into the branches, as though they were becoming part of the trees themselves. Multiple witnesses, including Mr. Blackwood, the guard assigned to the slave quarters, and 3 field hands, claim the girls could not possibly have left the locked building during the night. The guard swears he never moved from his post and heard nothing unusual until screams from early workers who discovered the bodies. The orchard itself presents further abnormalities. Despite the recent fire and turmoil at the plantation, the trees are bearing fruit in quantities never before recorded at Thornfield or any neighboring property. The fruit, upon examination, appears normal in all aspects, though none of the witnesses will consent to taste it. Due to the inexplicable nature of the deaths and the impossibility of the body's placement, I am ruling this incident as resulting from unknown causes. The local physician has been summoned to conduct a more thorough examination. The physician's report, filed 3 days later, offered no additional clarity. Dr. James Morrison wrote, "I have examined the bodies of the 2 female slaves as requested by Sheriff Harrison. Despite careful inspection, I can determine no cause of death. There are no marks of violence, no signs of poison, and no indication of disease. The integration of tree bark with their extremities defies medical explanation. The tissue shows no sign of post-mortem manipulation or artificial attachment. The bark appears to have grown naturally through and around their flesh. This phenomenon lies outside the realm of medical science as we understand it. I recommend immediate burial and, though I'm a man of science rather than superstition, suggest that the orchard trees be examined by someone with knowledge of botanical abnormalities before their fruit is consumed." Despite the doctor's recommendation, Overseer Blackwood ordered the bodies removed from the trees, a process that reportedly required sawing through the branches, as the bark could not be separated from the girl's flesh, and buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation property. As for the orchard, economic pressures following the Montgomery deaths led Blackwood to ignore concerns about the fruit. The abundant crop was harvested and sold at market, fetching premium prices due to its unusual size, color, and sweetness. According to sales records from Baltimore markets, fruit from Thornfield Plantation that season sold out faster than any other. Buyers reportedly fought over the last baskets, describing the peaches and apples as the sweetest ever tasted and addictive in flavor. Many purchased extra quantities for preserving. By autumn of 1853, something strange began happening throughout Howard County and neighboring regions. Medical records and newspaper articles from the period document an unusual number of cases involving people experiencing vivid nightmares, walking in their sleep, and reporting whispered voices when alone. More disturbing were the accounts of children who had consumed Thornfield fruit, claiming they could hear the sisters singing when they passed near trees. Several families reported finding their children standing silently in orchards or before single trees in their yards, staring upward at the branches as though listening to something only they could hear. The following spring, a peculiar phenomenon was observed throughout the region. In yards and orchards where Thornfield fruit had been consumed, trees began producing fruit with unusual characteristics. The most commonly reported abnormality was fruit that, when cut open, revealed what appeared to be face-like patterns in the flesh and seeds. Local ministers declared these occurrences a form of mass hysteria or the work of the devil. Town meetings were held, and a decision was eventually reached to cut down and burn the Thornfield orchard entirely. Overseer Blackwood, who had been attempting to maintain the plantation until it could be sold, vehemently opposed this plan, insisting the valuable orchard was his rightful compensation for years of service to the Montgomery family. On the day designated for the orchard's destruction, May 12, 1854, a group of 20 men from surrounding farms and plantations arrived at Thornfield with axes and saws. What they found was Blackwood's body hanging from the central tree in the orchard, the same tree from which one of the sisters had been found a year earlier. Unlike the sisters, Blackwood had clearly died by suicide, a rope around his neck. Clutched in his hand was a blood-stained note that read only, "They won't let me leave. They sing all night." The trees are hungry again. The men proceeded with their grim task, cutting down every tree in the orchard and burning them in massive pyres that reportedly burned for 3 days. Witnesses claimed the wood made unusual sounds as it burned, creaking and popping that some described as resembling screams or whispered words in an unknown language. Following the destruction of the orchard, the Thornfield property remained abandoned for nearly a decade. Subsequent owners attempted to revive the plantation, but crops planted on the former orchard land invariably failed. According to local records, the soil appeared unusually dark and moist, regardless of weather conditions, and workers repeatedly reported finding what appeared to be human teeth when plowing the fields. In 1867, 14 years after the deaths of the sisters, a northern businessman purchased the property at auction with the intention of establishing a lumber operation on the overgrown land. During the initial clearing, workers made a disturbing discovery. At the exact locations where the original orchard trees had stood, young saplings had emerged. Despite the thorough burning of the previous trees, including their root systems, these new growths appeared to be the same species. More unsettling was the discovery that the unmarked graves of the two sisters at the property's edge had been disturbed, not by animals or grave robbers, but from within. The wooden markers were splintered outward, and the earth above each grave had subsided as though the contents had somehow been removed from below. No bodies were ever found, but workers reported finding strange root-like growths extending from the graves to the new saplings in the former orchard. Roots that, when cut, leaked a substance that appeared more like blood than sap. The businessman abandoned his venture shortly thereafter, citing unfavorable conditions in his official correspondence, but reportedly telling associates that something walks between those trees at night, humming a song that makes men weep with visions of their own deaths. To this day, the former Thornfield property remains largely undeveloped. A small subdivision attempted in the 1970s was abandoned after multiple construction accidents and reports from new homeowners of 2 female figures walking among the decorative trees at night. The land is currently designated as a nature preserve, though locals still warn against eating fruit from the wild trees that grow there or listening too closely to the sound the wind makes through their leaves. Some residents of Howard County maintain that on certain nights, particularly in early spring when fruit trees bloom, two figures can be seen moving among the trees in old orchards throughout the region. They appear to be young women, their movements described as fluid and graceful, almost as though they're dancing. Those who claim to have seen them up close report that their eyes are entirely white, like fresh apple flesh, and their skin has the texture of smooth bark. Is it mass hysteria, a regional folktale that grew from a tragic but mundane historical event? Perhaps. But those familiar with the story point to one undeniable fact. Howard County orchards remain among the most productive in the nation, yielding fruit of remarkable size and sweetness. Local growers follow traditions passed down through generations, leaving small offerings at the base of their oldest trees, never cutting down a fruit tree without planting another, and always acknowledging the sisters with a whispered thanks during harvest. And when asked directly if they believe the legend, many will simply smile and say, "The trees remember." The sisters made sure of that. If you find yourself walking through an orchard at dusk and feel eyes upon you, or hear what sounds like soft humming among the rustling leaves, perhaps consider it a gentle reminder. The land remembers what was done there, and those who were sacrificed for its bounty may still be watching, waiting from just behind the bark and branches. The most disturbing aspect of this story, according to paranormal researchers who have investigated the case, is not the possibility that the sisters somehow merged with the trees of Thornfield Orchard. Rather, it is the implication of what happened to all the fruit that was sold and consumed from those trees in the year following their transformation. Fruit described as unusually sweet, unusually addictive, and grown from soil enriched by generations of suffering. Consider that for a moment. Consider what might live on inside you if your ancestors were among those who purchased and ate the Thornfield harvest of 1853. Consider what might be listening, even now, as you hear this tale. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a folklorist specializing in African diasporic traditions at Georgetown University, suggests that the sisters' story might represent a powerful form of resistance through spiritual practices brought from their homeland. In numerous West African traditions, particularly those from Guinea and surrounding regions, there exist beliefs about the ability of the human spirit to merge with natural elements as a form of escape from or resistance to oppression. What European-descended Americans might view as a horror story could, from another cultural perspective, represent a profound reclaiming of power. These young women, torn from their homeland and subjected to unimaginable cruelty, potentially found a way to transform their captivity into something that would haunt their oppressors for generations. This perspective offers a different dimension to the tale, one where the sisters were not victims of some supernatural occurrence, but perhaps its orchestrators, turning the very land that was meant to be their prison into an instrument of justice that continues to resonate through time. The last official investigation into the Thornfield incident occurred in 1992, when construction began on a highway expansion that would cut through a portion of the former plantation land. During excavation, workers uncovered a collection of unusual artifacts, a leather-bound book written in multiple languages, including what linguistic experts identified as an ancient form of Fula, a language spoken in Guinea, a collection of small carved wooden figures arranged in a circle, and most disturbing, two preserved human hearts encased in what appeared to be tree resin. Carbon dating placed the hearts at approximately 150 years old, corresponding precisely with the time of the sisters' deaths. The hearts showed no sign of decomposition, despite their age, and most bizarrely, seemed to maintain a slight rhythmic pulsation when in proximity to living plants, according to the initial field report. This detail was omitted from later official documentation, attributed to measurement error. All artifacts were transferred to the Smithsonian Institution for further study, but were subsequently listed as misplaced during cataloging. Attempts by journalists and researchers to locate these items have been unsuccessful, leading to speculation about institutional cover-ups or theft by private collectors. The highway was eventually rerouted, officially due to environmental concerns, but rumored to be because of an unprecedented number of equipment failures and worker accidents at the original site. Today, in certain rural parts of Maryland, modern descendants of slaves who worked the region's plantations maintain a tradition of leaving offerings at the base of old orchard trees, particularly those that bear fruit out of season or seem to thrive without care. When asked about this practice, many claim it's simply an old family tradition, while others speak in hushed tones about keeping the sisters content and respecting those who watch from the wood. Perhaps most chilling are the whispered warnings still passed down through generations of local families. Never cut down a fruit tree that was planted before the Civil War. Never build a home where an orchard once stood. And never, under any circumstances, fall asleep beneath the branches of a tree that blooms out of season, for the dreams that come may not be your own, and the sisters are always seeking new vessels through which to expand their reach. These offerings typically include small carved wooden figures, similar to those found during the highway excavation, and cups of sweetened water. As one elderly resident of Howard County put it, "Those girls didn't die that night in 1853. They just found a better way to live and a longer memory than any human could have. They're still here, in every bite of fruit from these old orchards, in every tree that shouldn't be growing but is. They're waiting, watching, whispering their story to anyone who'll listen closely enough, and someday they might decide it's time for more than whispers." In the winter of 2012, a genetic study of heirloom fruit varieties from the Howard County region made an unusual discovery. Trees believed to be descendants of stock from several pre-Civil War plantations, including the former Thornfield property, shared a unique genetic marker not found in any other known fruit varieties worldwide. More puzzling was the presence of genetic material that appeared to be human DNA integrated into the cellular structure of the fruit, a phenomenon the researchers deemed scientifically impossible. The study was discontinued shortly after this discovery, its funding abruptly revoked. The lead researcher relocated to a university in Europe and has declined all requests to discuss the project further. Some local residents claim that certain old families in the region still maintain small, private orchards descended from Thornfield stock. The fruit from these trees is never sold commercially, but shared only among those who understand the responsibility of consuming it. These individuals reportedly exhibit unusual characteristics, exceptional longevity, resistance to disease, and an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and crop yields. They also share another trait, a tendency to talk about trees as though they are listening, and to speak of two sisters not as figures from a distant past, but as watchful guardians who must be respected and appeased. Is there truth to the tale of the cursed slave sisters of Thornfield Plantation? Did they somehow transcend their mortal bodies to become something both more and less than human, their spirits infused into the very land that was meant to be the site of their subjugation? The rational mind rejects such possibilities. But in those Maryland orchards, where the fruit grows sweeter than it should in soil that remains unusually dark and rich, the wind sometimes carries what sounds like distant humming. And in those moments, even the most skeptical visitor might find themselves hurrying along the path, suddenly uneasy beneath the gentle gaze of countless leaves that turn, ever so slightly, to follow their passage. Remember this tale the next time you bite into a particularly sweet peach or apple. Consider what might be flowing into you with that sweetness, what ancient memories might be awakening with each swallow. For in consuming the fruit, you may be inviting something into yourself, something that has waited patiently, growing stronger with each passing season, spreading its influence tree by tree, bite by bite, across generations. The sisters are still waiting in the orchard, still watching, still remembering, and perhaps, through the fruit of their trees, still finding new ways to ensure that no one ever forgets the price paid for that sweetness. For God knows the truth of all mysteries, and in his light we find protection from the darkness that hides in ancient places. May Jesus Christ guide your steps away from shadows and toward his eternal light. What draws us to stories of the supernatural? Is it merely the thrill of fear from a safe distance, or something deeper? Perhaps a recognition that there are forces in this world that operate beyond our understanding. Forces that have watched humanity rise and fall, suffer and inflict suffering throughout the centuries. The tale of the Montgomery sisters continues to haunt those who study the darker chapters of American history. While many supernatural stories fade with time, this one persists, growing stronger with each retelling, much like the roots of those ancient orchard trees, spreading silently beneath the soil, unseen until they break the surface in unexpected places. Paranormal investigators Thomas and Rebecca Calloway documented their visit to the former Thornfield property in their 1978 book, Whispers from the Land: America's Haunted Plantations. Their experience offers one of the most detailed modern accounts of the phenomena still associated with the site. We arrived at the former Thornfield plantation on an unseasonably warm April morning. The property had been abandoned for nearly a decade following the failed housing development attempt, and nature had reclaimed much of the land. What was most striking, however, was the clear distinction between the areas where the main house and outbuildings had once stood, now overgrown with typical Maryland forest vegetation, and the former orchard land, which remained an open meadow dotted with fruit trees growing in a suspiciously orderly pattern. These trees should not have been there. According to historical records, the original orchard was burned entirely in 1854, and subsequent attempts to cultivate the land had all been abandoned. Yet here stood what appeared to be dozens of mature apple and peach trees, some showing the gnarled characteristics of specimens potentially over a century old. Our guide, a local historian who requested anonymity, refused to enter the orchard area, instead watching from the perimeter as we set up our equipment. "They don't mind visitors," he told us, "so long as you're respectful. But they know if you've come to mock or disbelieve." The scientific data would later reveal several anomalies. Soil in the orchard contained unusually high concentrations of iron, calcium, and phosphorus, elements abundant in human blood and bone. Electromagnetic readings showed fluctuating patterns typically associated with electrical equipment, despite the lack of power sources anywhere on the property. And audio recordings picked up what our sound engineer identified as sub-vocal frequencies, sounds just below the range of normal human hearing that nonetheless can influence mood and physical sensations. Those ones don't usually leave with everything they brought, either objects or peace of mind. We spent the daylight hours recording temperature readings, electromagnetic measurements, and soil samples from both the orchard area and surrounding land. As dusk approached, our historian guide grew increasingly anxious, insisting we conclude our investigation before full darkness. We convinced him to allow us just 1 hour after sunset, promising to remain at the orchard's edge, rather than venturing among the trees. What transpired in that hour has shaped our understanding of residual hauntings ever since. As the light faded, the temperature among the trees, which had been measuring slightly warmer than the surrounding area all day, dropped dramatically, creating a visible mist that rose from the ground and wound itself around the trunks and branches like spectral fingers. The fruit on the trees, which had appeared normal if unusually large during daylight, began to emit a faint luminescence, not enough to illuminate the area, but sufficient to create the disturbing impression of dozens of pale faces watching from among the leaves. At approximately 8:45 p.m., our audio equipment began recording what can only be described as humming, not a mechanical sound, but a musical one, like wordless voices singing in harmony. The melody was complex and unlike any folk or classical music tradition familiar to us, containing microtonal elements that created a sense of unease rather than beauty. At precisely 9 p.m., every piece of electrical equipment we had brought simultaneously failed: cameras, recorders, measuring devices, even our battery-powered flashlights. In the sudden darkness, the humming grew louder, now clearly audible to our unassisted ears, and the mist among the trees seemed to coalesce into moving shapes. What we witnessed next defies rational explanation, and had there been only one observer, might be dismissed as hallucination brought on by suggestion and darkness. But all 3 members of our team, as well as our reluctant guide, reported seeing the same phenomena. 2 female figures moving among the trees, their forms neither fully solid nor completely vaporous, but something in between, like living shadow given just enough substance to interact with the physical world. The figures appeared to be young women dressed in simple clothing, typical of the pre-Civil War era. Their movements were unnaturally fluid, more like the swaying of branches in wind than human walking. Most disturbing was the visible connection between the figures and the trees themselves. What appeared to be root-like extensions stretched from the trunks to merge with the women's extremities, so that at times it was impossible to determine where tree ended and figure began. For approximately 20 minutes, the figures moved through the orchard in what seemed to be a ritualistic pattern, occasionally reaching up to touch fruit or leaves with tender gestures almost like caresses. They never acknowledged our presence directly, though our guide insisted they were perfectly aware of us and deciding whether we meant harm. As the women completed their circuit of the orchard, they came to stand before the 2 largest trees at its center, trees our guide identified as growing from the exact spots where the sisters' bodies had been found in 1853. The humming reached a crescendo, and for a brief moment both figures turned in unison to look directly at our group. What happened next is difficult to convey in writing. None of us physically saw their faces transform, yet each of us came away with the absolute conviction that in those moments the women's features changed from human to something else. Faces composed of bark and leaf and fruit, with eyes like dark hollows leading somewhere beyond this world. A feeling of intense vertigo overtook us, accompanied by vivid mental flashes that each observer later described as memories that weren't my own. Images of ships and chains, of hands working soil until they bled, of rituals performed by firelight in a land of red earth and towering trees. And beneath these impressions, a bone-deep understanding of what the sisters had done and why. Not as victims of some supernatural curse, but as wielders of ancient power brought from across the ocean, power they had used to transform their captivity into a different kind of freedom, and their suffering into a judgment that would outlive their tormentors for generations. The moment passed as suddenly as it had begun. Our equipment simultaneously reactivated, each device showing 9:22 p.m., exactly 22 minutes after they had failed. The figures were gone, the mist dispersed, and the trees once again appeared as ordinary fruit trees in the darkness. We departed immediately, our guide hurrying us to our vehicles with warnings not to look back. 2 unusual events marked our exit. First, we discovered small braided tokens made of twigs and leaves placed in our equipment bags, items none of us had seen before and which had certainly not been there earlier. Second, upon reaching the main road, we realized we had left behind a valuable recording device at our monitoring station. When we returned the next morning to retrieve it, we found it placed prominently in the center of the access path, despite having been set up well within the orchard boundary. The device contained only 1 recording from the previous night. The rest had been erased. The remaining audio file captured a clear female voice, speaking just 4 words: "The trees are listening." The Calloway's experience at Thornfield closely aligns with dozens of other documented encounters over the decades. While skeptics suggest mass hallucination or the power of suggestion influenced by knowledge of the legend, certain elements remain difficult to explain away, particularly the physical evidence often left behind. Braided tokens, unexplained scars on trees that appear overnight in patterns resembling West African symbols, and fruit that, when tested, contains genetic anomalies defying scientific explanation. In 2005, the Maryland State Archives acquired a collection of papers from the estate of Nathan Blackwood's great-great-grandson, including what appears to be a personal journal kept by the overseer himself. The authenticity of this document remains contested by some historians, as the handwriting varies significantly throughout the text, sometimes appearing more feminine than Blackwood's verified signatures on official plantation records. Regardless of its provenance, the journal contains disturbing entries that shed new light on the sisters' story. If genuine, they suggest that what happened at Thornfield was not a spontaneous supernatural event, but something deliberately set in motion. A calculated act of resistance and retribution, conceived through a fusion of desperate circumstances and ancient knowledge. The most revelatory passage, dated March 19, 1853, reads, "The master has gone mad with his obsession. Today I witnessed him feeding his own blood to the trees, cutting his palm and pressing it to the bark, while the sisters sang in that tongue that makes my skin crawl. He believes they are helping him save the orchard, but I have seen the look that passes between them when his back is turned. They are not saving anything. They are transforming it. I confronted the elder sister alone this evening, away from her master's ears. For the first time, she spoke to me directly in halting English. We make trees remember. Trees live long. Trees see all. In our land, our people speak to trees, and trees keep promises." When I asked what promises these American trees could possibly keep to African slaves, her eyes changed. Something shifted behind them, like a door opening to somewhere else. "Trees everywhere, same trees," she said. "Roots touch across ocean. We teach these trees taste of suffering. They never forget. They pass memory through fruit, through seed, through soil. For generations they remember." I threatened to tell Montgomery of her words, and she smiled for the first time since arriving at Thornfield, a smile that will haunt my dreams until I die. "He know already," she said. "He think he use us, but we use him. Blood payment already made. Too late now." Later entries describe Blackwood's growing horror as he observed subtle changes in Montgomery's appearance and behavior. Moments when the plantation owner's movements echoed those of the sisters, instances where his voice seemed to carry their distinctive humming undertone, and most disturbing, occasions when Blackwood caught sight of what appeared to be bark-like textures spreading beneath the skin of Montgomery's hands and neck. The final entries become increasingly disjointed, with references to hearing the trees speaking with her voice, and fruit that bleeds when cut. The last coherent passage, dated just 2 days before the fire that would kill both Montgomerys, reads, "I understand now what they have done, not just to the master and his orchard, but to all who have partaken of its fruit. I have eaten of it myself. God help me, we all have. And now I feel them inside me, growing like seedlings in the soil of my mind, their memories, their suffering, their rage, the knowledge they carried across the water. When I close my eyes, I see their homeland. I feel the chains on my wrists, as if they were my own. Most terrifying of all, I find myself sympathizing with their vengeance. Is this my own conscience awakening, or their influence taking root? The mistress knows as well. I have seen her watching the sisters from her window, touching her stomach with a look of revulsion. She was with child before they came, 5 months along now, but refuses to call the midwife despite her time growing near. Yesterday, she whispered to me, "It doesn't move like a child should. It rustles." I dream of an orchard stretching across all of Maryland, across the whole South, trees bearing fruit, filled with memories of every cruelty inflicted on stolen bodies. Fruit that passes those memories to those who consume it and their children after them. A poison of truth that cannot be purged. God forgive me for my part in this. And God help us all when the harvest spreads beyond this place. The journal ends abruptly there, with several blank pages following before a final entry dated after the sisters were found in the orchard. This entry consists of just 5 words in handwriting, dramatically different from the rest of the journal. The trees are waiting. Watch. Historians remain divided on whether the Blackwood Journal represents an authentic primary source or an elaborate forgery created to enhance the legend. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, no relation to the Plantation family, a specialist in American folklore at the University of Maryland, suggests the truth may lie somewhere in between. The journal contains details about West African spiritual practices that would have been unknown to most Americans until much later in the 20th century. If it is a forgery, it's an extremely well-researched one, created by someone with advanced knowledge of both historical plantation operations and specific cultural traditions from Guinea. What makes the Thornfield case so compelling from a folklorist perspective is how it inverts the typical American ghost story paradigm. Rather than European American spirits haunting sites of their former lives, we have an instance of the oppressed creating a lasting spiritual presence that turns the very land, the thing they were brought to America to work against their will, into a vehicle for remembrance and perhaps retribution. Whether one believes in the supernatural elements or not, the story functions as a powerful metaphor for how the legacy of slavery continues to influence American society, the past literally bearing fruit in the present, forcing descendants of both the oppressors and the oppressed to consume and digest historical trauma. The most recent chapter in the Thornfield story began in 2017, when a severe drought affected much of the Mid-Atlantic region. As water restrictions were implemented and crops failed throughout Maryland, locals noted a strange phenomenon. Fruit trees on and around the former Thornfield property continued to thrive, their foliage remaining lush and their fruit abundant despite receiving no rainfall for over 60 days. Agricultural scientists from the University of Maryland, who investigated this anomaly, discovered that the root systems of these trees extended far deeper than is typical for their species, in some cases more than 40 feet into the ground, reaching aquifers that should have been inaccessible to surface vegetation. More disturbing was their finding that these roots formed an interconnected network extending far beyond the boundaries of the former plantation, linking seemingly unrelated trees across miles of Maryland countryside. Using ground-penetrating radar, they mapped portions of this network and found it roughly corresponded to the boundaries of pre-Civil War plantations that had once dominated the region. Dr. Samuel Richardson, the lead researcher, described it as an underground communication system that defies current botanical understanding, almost as though these separate trees function as a single organism sharing resources, information, and potentially other forms of exchange we don't yet comprehend. The drought study was abruptly defunded following these initial findings, with Richardson's team denied access to continue their research. In an interview with the local newspaper, Richardson expressed frustration with the university's decision. There was significant pressure from several prominent local families to discontinue our work. These are old Maryland names, descendants of plantation owners who still hold considerable influence in the region. They claimed our research was damaging property values and promoting superstitious thinking, but I can't help wondering if they feared what else we might discover about the true extent of this root network, and perhaps what it implies about their ancestors' actions. Richardson resigned from his position shortly after the interview and established an independent research organization dedicated to studying what he terms botanical memory, the theory that plants, particularly long-lived, Trees might record and store information about their surroundings in ways science has not yet recognized. His most controversial hypothesis suggests that the consumption of fruit from trees grown in soil where extreme human suffering occurred might indeed transfer something to those who eat it. Not supernatural memories, as the legend suggests, but plant compounds and microorganisms that could influence human neurochemistry, potentially affecting mood, dreams, and even gene expression in subtle ways that might be inherited by subsequent generations. We know that trauma can create epigenetic changes that pass through human generations, Richardson explained in a recent presentation. Is it so far-fetched to consider that the land itself, the very soil and what grows from it, might similarly carry and transmit the biochemical signatures of what has transpired there? And if so, what might we all be carrying within us from what our ancestors consumed? Local resident Mariah Johnson, a descendant of slaves who worked on Maryland plantations including Thornfield, offers a different perspective on the legend, one that embraces, rather than fears, its implications. Those sisters weren't cursed, they were liberators. They found a way to make sure what happened to them and thousands like them wouldn't be forgotten or written out of history books. Some call it a ghost story, but I see it as a remembering story. Every spring when the trees bloom around here, my grandmother would take me to the oldest orchard on our property. We'd bring offerings, not out of fear, but respect. She'd tell me, "The sisters make sure the land never forgets, and as long as we remember them, they protect us too." When I was a child, I once asked her if the stories about the fruit were true, if eating peaches and apples from these trees could put memories inside you that weren't your own. She looked at me for a long time before answering, "Child, every bite of food you take from this land carries history in it. Better to know that history, honor it, than pretend it isn't there." I still maintain that orchard, and yes, the trees bear fruit sweeter than any you'll find in stores, even in drought years when others fail. Do I believe they're watching through the trees, that they're still here in some form? All I know is that twice now, developers have tried to purchase my family's land for commercial projects, and twice their representatives left white-faced and shaking after walking the property alone. They never came back with offers. The most unsettling aspect of the Thornfield legend may be its implication for modern America. If, as the story suggests, the sisters found a way to infuse their experience, their suffering, their knowledge, and perhaps their justified rage, into the very ecosystem of Maryland, then what has been passed down through generations of fruit, through soil, through water, carrying dissolved components of that soil to other plants and waterways? How much of the history we think we've buried continues to circulate through us, unacknowledged but present, carried in the food we eat, the water we drink, the land we live upon? How many of our dreams and fears might be shaped by memories not our own, passed down not just through family stories or genetic inheritance, but through the literal consumption of a landscape that has absorbed centuries of human experience? Professor James Harrison, a geochemist specializing in soil composition analysis, offers a sobering scientific perspective that neither confirms nor dismisses the legend's core premise. We know definitively that human remains alter soil chemistry. Burial grounds show distinct chemical signatures that can persist for centuries or even millennia. These chemical changes affect what grows there and how it grows, potentially influencing the composition of fruits and vegetables in subtle but measurable ways. Modern agricultural practices tend to strip and homogenize these signatures through industrial fertilization and monocropping. But older orchards, particularly those that haven't been intensively managed with chemical inputs, could theoretically retain distinctive characteristics influenced by historical land use, including human burials, whether formal or informal. The chemical signature of these human remains would have been integrated into the soil ecology over generations, potentially creating unique microbial communities and mineral compositions that could indeed make fruit from such locations noticeably different in both appearance and biochemical makeup. When pressed on whether this scientific explanation might account for the more supernatural elements of the Thornfield legend, Harrison grows thoughtful. Science can explain why fruit from certain old orchards might taste different, or even affect those who consume it in subtle physiological ways. Many plantations had unmarked slave cemeteries, and historical accounts suggest that abuse and punishment sometimes resulted in impromptu burials that were never recorded. But the collective human experience of interacting with such places, the dreams reported, the visions, the sense of presence, speaks to something beyond mere chemistry. Perhaps what we're observing is the intersection of objective physical processes with subjective human meaning-making, the way our minds process and interpret subtle environmental cues through the lens of historical knowledge and cultural narrative. Or perhaps there are aspects of reality, particularly regarding consciousness and its relationship to the physical world, that our current scientific paradigms are inadequate to fully explain. Western science has largely dismissed such beliefs, but the persistence of experiences like those associated with the Thornfield orchard across diverse populations and time periods gives one pause. Whether approached as supernatural legend, historical metaphor, or unexplained scientific phenomenon, the story of the sisters found in the orchard trees continues to resonate precisely because it touches on fundamental questions about justice, memory, and the true nature of human consciousness. Most cultures throughout human history have maintained that consciousness can exist beyond individual human bodies, that it can reside in or interact with elements of the natural world. If the sisters did somehow transform themselves into something that could outlast their mortal bodies, something that could bear witness through generations, was it an act of desperation, of vengeance, or of profound hope? Those who approach the old orchard lands with respect, acknowledging the history they represent, report peaceful experiences, sometimes even dreams described as healing or clarifying. But those who come with mockery or disbelief, or worse, those descended from families implicated in plantation-era cruelties who have never acknowledged that history, allegedly experience something far darker. Nightmares filled with what feels like remembered trauma, unexplained physical symptoms, and, in extreme cases, visions of themselves transformed into twisted, root-bound forms, unable to escape the soil. A belief that someday someone would understand their story and recognize the full humanity that was denied them in life. Local Howard County legends insist that the sisters are selective in their hauntings. Paranormal researcher Rebecca Calloway, who returned to the site annually for 20 years following her initial investigation, developed what she called a respectful protocol for those wishing to visit lands associated with the legend. Approach with humility and openness. Bring a small offering, traditionally clean water mixed with honey or fruit from your own garden. Acknowledge aloud the history of the place and those who suffered there. Most importantly, express willingness to bear witness, to carry the memory forward rather than allowing it to be forgotten. Those who follow this protocol report sensing a presence that, while never entirely comfortable, feels more protective than threatening. Several visitors have described a sensation like gentle hands on their shoulders from behind, or hearing what sounds like distant singing that fades if they turn toward it. Calloway's final visit to the site, just months before her death from cancer in 1999, yielded what she considered the most profound evidence of the sisters' continued presence. I was alone at the orchard's edge at dusk, having followed my usual protocol. The trees were heavy with late summer fruit, and the cicadas were singing their evening chorus. I'd brought my recording equipment as always, though after 2 decades, I expected nothing new. As the light faded, I felt unusually drowsy, not frightened, but as though a gentle suggestion to sleep was being pressed upon me. I allowed myself to close my eyes, just for a moment. What happened next was neither dream nor fully waking experience, but something in between. I perceived two young women sitting beside me, their features shifting between human appearance and something like animated wood and leaf. They spoke not in English, but somehow I understood. "You have been faithful in witness," one said. The elder sister I somehow knew. "Now we show you why we remain." What followed was a vision of the orchard through time, flashes of the past, present, and what seemed to be the future. I saw the original Thornfield trees bearing fruit that was distributed throughout the region, the chemical compounds of the sisters' transformed bodies spreading through those who consumed it. I saw generations of children born to those consumers, carrying subtle alterations in their neurochemistry that made them more empathetic, more receptive to the suffering of others, more resistant to the kind of moral blindness that had allowed slavery to exist. I saw how this influence had spread through watersheds, through pollination, through generations of fruit and seed and root, creating an ever-expanding network of botanical memory centered on Maryland but gradually reaching outward. I understood that the sisters had created not just a haunting, but a generational correction, a slow, patient rewiring of human capacity for cruelty, beginning with those most directly responsible for their suffering, but eventually touching all who lived upon and consumed the products of that land. Most astonishing was the vision's conclusion. A future where the root network they'd established had grown to connect trees across the entire eastern seaboard, creating what they called the Remembering Land, soil and plants that carried not just nutrients but human consciousness, human memory, human witness. "This is why we stay," the younger sister told me. "The work not finished yet. Many generations more. But someday no one eat fruit from this land without tasting truth." I woke as dawn broke, finding myself still seated where I'd been the evening before, my recording equipment running beside me. When I reviewed the tape later, I found 8 hours of what appeared to be silence. But when I ran it through audio enhancement software, beneath the background noise of insects and wind was what sound analysts later confirmed to be two distinct vocal patterns sustaining a single harmonic tone. A sound impossible for any one human throat to produce continuously for 8 hours without pause. Calloway's experience, which she documented in her final book published posthumously, is dismissed by skeptics as the hallucination of a woman whose lifelong obsession with the paranormal was intensified by her terminal illness and medication. Yet others point to the audio recording, which has been analyzed by multiple independent sound engineers who cannot explain its acoustic properties, as evidence that something beyond conventional understanding may indeed linger in the old orchard land. Today, the former Thornfield property remains largely undeveloped, protected by a combination of conservation easements, local superstition, and the determined efforts of several Howard County families. Some descended from plantation owners, others from the enslaved people who worked their land, who have formed an unusual alliance to preserve the site as what they call a living memorial. Unlike conventional historical markers that reduce complex human experiences to a few sentences on a metal plaque, this memorial consists simply of the land itself, the trees that grow there, and the understanding passed down through generations of local residents about what occurred there and why it must not be forgotten. Visitors to the site today report a range of experiences, from the mundane to the inexplicable. Many describe a distinctive atmosphere, a stillness that feels alert rather than empty, as though the landscape itself is attentive to their presence. Others report sudden, vivid mental images of two young women moving among the trees, always just at the edge of clear vision, retreating when approached directly. Perhaps most compelling are the consistent reports of dreams that follow visits to the site. dreams of being someone else, somewhere else, in another time. These dreams often share specific elements: the sensation of hands working soil, the weight of fruit being harvested, the sound of voices singing in an unfamiliar language, and a profound sense of both loss and determination. It's like remembering something that never happened to you, one recent visitor described. Except while you're in the dream, you know with absolute certainty that it did happen to someone, and that knowing stays with you after you wake, along with the feeling that you've been entrusted with something important, something you're now responsible for carrying forward. Is the legend of the cursed slave sisters of Thornfield Plantation merely a folk tale evolved from historical tragedy? A metaphor for the way America's history of slavery continues to influence its present? Or could there be truth to the claim that consciousness sometimes finds ways to persist beyond conventional understanding, particularly when driven by profound injustice and the desperate need for witness? Science offers no definitive answers, but those familiar with the orchard and its history suggest that perhaps the truth is best understood not through instruments or analysis, but through direct experience, through standing at the orchard's edge as dusk falls, listening to the wind moving through leaves that some believe still whisper with the sisters' voices, still watch with their eyes, still remember with their awareness. And perhaps the most profound aspect of their legacy lies not in fear, but in transformation, in the possibility that what began as two young women's desperate act of resistance has evolved over generations into something more profound, a slow, patient healing of the land and those who live upon it, as memories once suppressed rise to consciousness through root and branch and fruit, one season, one harvest, one bite at a time. For those who believe, the sisters are not figures from a distant past, but present guardians still actively engaged in their work, the work of ensuring that America cannot forget what was done in those orchards, on those plantations, to those human beings who, even in the most extreme circumstances, found ways to claim their power and their voice. In the words of Mariah Johnson, every spring when those old trees bloom, the sisters are reminding us, memory outlasts chains, outlasts whips, outlasts laws written by those who thought themselves masters. Memory flows through the land itself, and as long as we eat of its fruit, we carry their witness forward. And so the orchard continues its silent vigil, trees growing and bearing fruit, roots spreading unseen beneath the soil, connecting past to present to future in ways both science and spirituality are still working to comprehend. The sisters, whether understood as restless spirits, botanical memory, or powerful metaphor, remain, watching, waiting, whispering their truth to any who will listen. Those who have heard their whispers say the message is always the same. The land remembers. The trees bear witness, and true justice, like fruit ripening slowly on the branch, may take generations to manifest, but its sweetness, when finally tasted, is worth the wait. For in the end, isn't that what all ghost stories really ask of us? Not merely to shiver at shadows, but to recognize that what we call hauntings may be the past's desperate attempt to be acknowledged, to be reckoned with, to be finally and fully seen. The Thornfield sisters found their way to be seen, not through historical records that barely noted their existence, not through the mercy of those who claimed ownership of their bodies, but through the land itself, transformed by their suffering and their power into a living testament that continues to bear fruit in the present day. Next time you walk beneath orchard trees, consider for a moment the possibility that they are not merely silent witnesses to human history, but active participants in its remembrance and transmission. Consider what memories might reside in their roots, what knowledge might flow through their branches, what truths might be waiting, sweet and terrible, in the fruit they offer. For God knows the truth of all mysteries, and in His light we find protection from the darkness that hides in ancient places. May Jesus Christ guide your steps away from shadows and toward His eternal light.